Thank you for joining us. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this first debate on the energy sector. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to our interpreter, Dominique, who will do the translation, simultaneous translation, French to English.
So if you need to follow this session in English, please don't hesitate to click on the globe that's at the bottom of your screen and click on English if you need to follow the session in English. Donc, je profite aussi pour faire un gentil rappel
I also take this opportunity to remind our speakers to speak slowly enough for interpretation purposes.
Donc, je m'appelle Eva Radek.
My name is Eva Radek. I'm the Director of Programs at Climate Change. Climate Change is an international association founded in 2015, just prior to COP21, which purpose is to support non-state actors in their strategies for fighting against climate change. Our activities are based on several tools. We carry out our activities throughout the year. We have three main pillars. The first pillar, which is to inform people. And we do this through our portal, online portal. Everything that is on our website is found both in French and in English. You will find a mapping of our actions and then a library, climate library. The second pillar, which we use, is mobilizing. We do this through coalitions, through topic coalition, African coalition and international coalition, which are invited together every year during our summit. Of course, this year we were supposed to organize our summit in Kigali. It had to be cancelled because of the COVID pandemic. So we had to think about our formats this year, and we decided to go for virtual workshops, which is what we have been doing since July. And the third pillar is to analyze, and this is what we're going to be doing this week with our Observatory for Climate Action. This week, we're going to review the annual report of our climate action for 2020. We're going to be looking at actions from the civil societies, from the NGOs, etc., in the 6 sectors of emission. Again, these documents are both in French and English. And we also have other reports on other topics and study cases, which you can find on our website. Okay, this session this morning is part of a cycle of restitution sessions with the following question: has the COVID-19 accelerated or hampered climate strategies in the energy sector? Wishing you a good debate. We're going to be talking about the energy sector this morning. Hello, everyone. Before we start the conversation with our speakers, my name is Amaury Parel, and I'm the coordinator for the Observatory at Climate Change. Thank you, Eva, for introducing us. Before we start this conversation, I'm going to be sharing about the lessons from the annual report, especially in the sector of energy and electricity production. Coming back to our main theme of this week, which is, has the COVID-19 accelerated or hampered the climate strategies? Straight away, we could say that the pandemic has highlighted tendency that were already implemented in 2019. First of all, touching base on the world scale, the restructuring of electricity and production plays at force march. After a rise of 2.5% at world scale, we've seen a decline in Europe up to 14%. Also in India, in America, where things were up before. In Asia, it's been more moderate. Now, this decline in 2019 is due to a moderate growth of gross demand. Of electricity demand, and also the coal-based historic fall in coal, which has reduced the carbon print, but still too far from from the 2 degrees target. You can see this on the graphic on your right-hand side. Whereas the renewable energy still show the biggest growth in capacity, with a rise of 6% in 2019, representing about 27% of the global electric mix, including rights to electricity. Now, regarding the impacts of the 2019 crisis and the COVID-19 crisis, what we can notice is that there has been a fall in demand that has been absorbed mainly by coal. Priority were given to the renewable energy. So the total has dropped by 3.6%, whereas the renewable energy have had an access everywhere, and therefore the cheaper cost of exploitation. So therefore in Europe, the production of electricity, renewable energy has reached a rate of 40%, and for the first time went over the fossil energy. We can also note the negative impact because it impacted many companies, especially in developing countries, and combined to a drop in the income. So we've seen for the first time a decline in the access to electricity, especially in Africa, for the first time in decades. Now, regarding the recovery plans, have been given contradictory signals from one country to another. About $13 billion for the moment. So these recovery plans arrived at a time when we were observing some positive signals and a drop in the subsidies after a constant rise for many years and a moderate rise for the renewable energy. Now, if we look at the actors as such in the private sectors, we have noticed a restructuration that has been speeding up. On the one hand, we've got the oil and gas companies. We've seen a slight change, of course, with an increasing asset impairment in 2019 and also in 2020 with social plans for many of them. This has also been increased by the fall of the oil price, which has made things more fragile. Also, a growing pressure of the investors, and also a more attractive and stable market for electricity and the renewable energy, which is why we have noticed NextEra, for example, in Florida, have gone beyond Dexter. So these factors have also pushed the companies to move towards renewable energy with more and more transactions in that sector. We've seen investments that should continue to increase from 2020 onward, as you can see on our graphic on the right-hand side of the slide, especially of European companies, Shell, BP. They have more and more pressure from public sector and the civil society as well, and investors to do so. The low carbon technology only represent 1% of their investments, the oil and gas companies. This is to be reminded. Now, regarding electric utilities, they have closed in 2020 more coal plants capacities than opened, especially in the US. 13 were closed down. In Portugal also and Spain, they have closed down a few coal plants. And this was not compensated by the opening of new coal plants in China or in India. And this has also affected gas, but in a lesser measure. Now, are these movements that were accelerated by the 2020 crisis, would they manage to reach the Paris Agreement? No, according to a large survey, which covered about 50 electrical companies. They will continue to integrate their decarbonation strategies into their long-term investment plans. Only few of these plans actually are aligned with the Paris Agreement. You can see the name there. And 35 of them have chosen have made the choice of an investment. Now, to continue in the private sector, all sectors included, we have noticed an important change in direct purchase, as you can see on the right-hand side of your graphic. Direct purchase have helped to secure prices and also to limit the risks and to also finance new consumption. 20 JW of PPA that were signed in 2019 in total, which is about 1/10 of all the capacity. And these were signed by about 100 companies, all sectors included. Not only we can notice that it's no longer the large company or the GAFA, or the large consumers, which were also signing these kind of contracts in the past. Now, if we take a look finally at the local actors, stakeholders, next slide, the local governments rather, we can also notice that cities and local authorities, governments have multiplied many means to reach that 100% renewable energy in 2020. This goal of 100% was reached by 58 cities. We've seen also another trend to do PPA with the renewable suppliers. So there's been a call for proposals to cover this, as had been the case in Chicago or in Canberra in Australia. Others have been facilitating purchase with several companies, like in Melbourne. And these purchases have helped them to develop new capacities of production without having to produce everything on their own territory. Now, with these certification of the guarantee of green energy, these tools seem now to be privileged by the local governments compared to the remunicipalization. And this choice of remunicipalization has been quite strong in the last few years, especially in Germany and in Spain. But recently, we've seen the opposite in Japan recently as well. Now, also, study cases have shown that local governments tend to favor also the development of corporations, and cooperatives is increasing rapidly, especially in Europe with the energetic communities that has been recognized by the EU. And these cooperatives are quickly developing. We've noticed 3,500 of them in 2020 in Europe, even though the production remains marginal, now increasing the growth of self-consumption. Of course, the momentum seems to not have been affected by the crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, or the drop in investment of consumption. But in countries with high income, it's been progressing more quickly in Germany, for example, or in Australia, as opposed to developing countries. And finally, among other levers, we can also notice the increasing digitalization against fossil fuel. And several local governments have been carrying out legal actions. Like in India, they seized the Supreme Court against a new coal mine because of the damage caused to the climate. And then, of course, the citizens also are very active and are very mobilized in Germany, for example. And there's been an increasing number of citizens have been standing against, for example, in Norway, to push the government to change their laws against settlements of wind turbine. Now, I'm glad to welcome now this morning with us Mathieu Ozano, who is the director of the think tank, the Shift Project, who is also the author of many books. And I think Frédéric Boyer, who has just joined us. He's the project manager, Covenant of Mayors and Energy Cities. Jean-Yves Grandidier is a founder and CEO of Valorem, and also Alain Mest, who is economic analyst at Sandex. He's also an expert member of the French Citizen Convention on Climate. I think now I would have a first series of questions on the impact of the pandemic on all these sectors. And secondly, we will talk about the various strategies, and we will listen to your expertise on those various topics. Now, first of all, Mathieu Ozano, do you think that this crisis and the impact on the energy sector has actually affected the capacity of investment of oil and gas companies? Has it managed to move forward this the peak of gas and oil offer? Thank you for inviting me. So sorry for being late. This crisis has been unprecedented, of course, for the energy sector.
Très forts aléas pour le oil and gas.
And very impactful for the oil and gas production. There's been a kind of hibernation of the investments at large. At a time when heavy questions were being raised, especially for the oil industry, just simply to maintain their production. The International Energy Agency has taken into account this hibernation because of the COVID-19 crisis. The IEA has been warning that it is not unlikely that this default of the production and the impact could actually lead to some issues of energy safety. We already had a heavy kind of atmosphere or context before the COVID-19 crisis, and the discoveries have been very low in the oil conventions in the last few years. And on the other hand, there was an explosion of the shale gas because of the level of shale gas, because of the level of depths. Just to answer simply, we are highly uncertain about the capacity of the oil companies to maintain their production. But it is possible, wherever there is a peak due to the current recession, it's not an exit as such, but it's kind of a crisis, if you like, or a decline. It's not either heading to decarbonation. So the agency, International Agency for Energy, is saying it's possible that investors might lose their appetite for investing in oil companies before the society starts doing without it. So we're really looking at the long-term capacities of oil companies to continue to produce and provide oil. So we are in a kind of an uncertainty area, or a zone of uncertainty that had already started before the crisis. And of course, the fact that many investments and many companies were on hold, this has been accelerating this uncertainty. And there is an issue of knowing whether or not in the long run, the oil company will be able to continue producing and maintain their production. At a Shift project, we had to really organize ourselves, not just for climate issues, but for the safety of the supply, to make up for the issue of future supply safety. Yes, we can see how the crisis has impacted and also the recovery plans may not actually cancel all these impacts due to the crisis. Yes, now I'm going to turn to Jean-Yves Grandidier, founder and CEO of Valorem. The drop or decline in electricity was absorbed mainly by the renewable energy and coal, which had a priority access to energy. Now let's talk about these two factors. What about this crisis? Has it shown the possibility of a mix, of an electricity mix? Have we not been exaggerating? We're talking about the energy mix.
Oui, bonjour,
Hello,
bonjour à tous et
everyone.
merci pour votre
Thank you
invitation.
for your invitation.
En fait, la
Yes,
baisse
the
de
drop
la production d'électricité au charbon
of
pendant la période de Covid,
electricity
et vous l'avez
power
très bien
with
montré,
coal
en
during the
fait, elle s'est
COVID-19
amorcée déjà à
had already
partir de
started
l'année 2018 et
in
encore plus fortement de l'année
2019
2019, et en particulier en
and
Europe.
2018,
Et en
actually
fait,
in
cette baisse
2019
de
in
la
Europe, and this
production
decline
d'électricité au charbon est due
in
à
electricity production with
à des
coal
conditions de marché
was
qui ont
due to market
beaucoup changé
conditions
entre
which have changed
ce qui se passait dans le
drastically
milieu des
between
années
what was
2010,
going on in
2014,
the
2015, 2016, où à un
2010,
moment donné, à ce
2014,
moment-là,
15,
la
etc.,
production d'électricité au charbon avait même un
when
petit
coal
peu
electricity
augmenté en Allemagne
had
et qu'on
raised
avait
a
à
little bit in
l'époque dit que
Germany. And at the time,
effectivement,
we
les
said that
énergies renouvelables ne permettaient
renewable
pas une réduction
energy,
de cette production d'électricité au charbon. Et injustement, je dirais, on dit c'est injustement.
and on the other hand,
Et effectivement, et les conditions que l'on a aujourd'hui, et ce, à
and the
partir de
condition that we
2010.
have
Et donc,
today,
les deux phénomènes qui font
okay, those two
que ces
phenomena
conditions ont changé, c'est d'une part le
have
fait
made
que
things change, and
le
the
prix du
fact
carbone, du
that the price
CO2
of
au
the
marché du Luxembourg,
CO2,
qui était autour de
which
5
used
euros
to
la
be
tonne de
around 5
CO2
euros per
dans les
ton
années
of
2015,
CO2 in the
est
2015,
remonté
has gone up
autour de
again
25 euros.
to
Tout ça parce
25
que,
euros
effectivement, les quotas attribués trop largement
because
aux
the quotas
industriels,
that were
les
given
quotas
too
d'émission
largely to the
faisaient qu'il
industries
y avait une pléthore de crédits carbone et que la Commission européenne
made
a
it that
commencé à
the European
retirer du
Commission
marché
started
un certain nombre de
pulling
crédits,
out
ce
from
qui
the
fait qu'il
market
y a eu un
some credits. So
rééquilibrage
there
et une
was
augmentation
a
du carbone.
rebalancing
Le
of the price
signal
of
prix quand
carbon.
même du carbone est extrêmement
So the
important pour
price, the
justement
signal given by the
pouvoir
rise of the price of the
s'orienter
carbon
vers
is very
une réduction
important
des
to
émissions de gaz
show
à effet
that
de
we
serre.
need to
Le deuxième
go
phénomène,
towards more
c'était le
reduction of
fait
the
que
gas emission. Now, the second phenomenon
c'était toujours un problème de marché.
that it
C'est
was always a market
que
issue.
c'est le moment de l'explosion du gaz de schiste
It's
et du
when the
pétrole de
shale
schiste aux
gas
États-Unis, mais du gaz de schiste
exploded,
qui
really,
finalement, comme il n'y avait pas les
because
infrastructures
we
pour
did not have
pouvoir
the necessary
exporter ce gaz des
infrastructures to
États-Unis à
export
l'époque,
this
a
gas from the
remplacé
US at the
dans les
time. So it
centrales
was to
thermiques
replace
américaines le charbon.
in the
Or,
two
les
thermal
Américains sont les plus gros
plants by
producteurs au
coal.
monde
So
avec la Chine de
Americans
charbon.
are the
Et
greatest,
donc,
with
ce
China,
charbon qui, lui,
greatest
est aisément
producers of
transportable, puisque c'est un
coal,
combustible solide
which is
dans
of
des
course
bateaux,
something that is
et
much
a
easier
été,
to
en fait,
transport,
acheté
and that was
et a été
bought
consommé
and
par les grandes
consumed by
installations
the
de production
large
d'électricité
plants
qui équipent un certain nombre de pays européens depuis
which
longtemps,
equip
qui
a
font
number of European
la base de
countries.
leur production d'électricité. Et donc, c'est parce que effectivement, on avait du charbon pas cher
Because we had cheap coal at
que
the time,
il y a une production
that was
d'électricité
why
au
the
charbon et que
coal
alors
electricity
qu'à
was
à
going
ce
on
moment-là, un
at
certain nombre de
a
centrales
time
à
when
cycle
a
combiné
few
gaz
plants,
qui émettent 2 fois moins de gaz à effet de serre ont
especially
été,
gas plants
ont été
which
fermées, quoi, ont été mises
release
ce qu'on
less
appelle
gas
sous
emissions,
contrôle.
were actually closed down.
Et là, aujourd'hui, le prix du gaz
As
a
of today, the
baissé, et
price
donc
of gas
avec
has
cette
dropped,
augmentation du prix du carbone,
and
de
with
5
the rise of the price
à
of
25
carbon from
euros la
5 to
tonne, ce qui fait que
25
pour un mégawattheure,
5 euros
c'est
per
25
ton
euros par mégawattheure à peu près.
per
Voilà. Et
megawatt.
que le cycle combiné gaz, lui, a un coût, a une émission beaucoup
And
plus faible.
the
Eh bien,
cost of the
aujourd'hui,
gas emission is much
le
lower.
gaz a
So what's
été pris
happening
en
today is
premier dans
that
ce
the
qu'on
gas
appelle
was
l'ordre de
taken
mérite.
first
C'est vraiment un
in the
mécanisme de
merit
marché,
order. It's
du
really the
marché de
market that
l'électricité. Et
decides
c'est aujourd'hui,
that.
effectivement, les centrales à gaz
And
qui
today,
tournent
the
en Europe
gas
avant les centrales à charbon. Les
plants
centrales à
are
charbon
going
sont
before
là
the
pour
oil
assurer la
plants.
pointe.
Their
Donc,
oil
comme
plants are really
effectivement,
there
il
to
y a moins de pointe puisque la
make up for
consommation
what's
s'est
lacking.
réduite,
So
eh
the
bien, effectivement,
consumption
celles
has
qui sont
been
les centrales
reduced.
qui sont appelées marginalement, les premières centrales qui sont appelées,
So the first
c'est les
plants
renouvelables,
really
c'est ensuite le
have been the
nucléaire parce
renewable
qu'elles ont des
energy,
coûts
then the
marginaux de
nuclear
production
energy,
extrêmement bas.
because their
Hein,
costs
et
are
donc, dans
very
l'ordre
low,
de
their
mérite, elles sont
production
appelées les
costs are very
premières. C'est
low.
un
So
peu
they're
technique, mais
called
c'est comme ça que fonctionne le marché de qualité.
first, if you like, because it's a kind of a merit order.
Et
That's the way
effectivement, c'est les
things
centrales à gaz
function.
ensuite qui,
So the
pendant
gas
cette période de
plants
baisse des
during
consommations,
that
ont fait la
time
plupart
of
du temps
decline
le dernier
were
kilowattheure appelé marginalement
were
pour
the
pouvoir
last one
boucler
to be
l'équilibre
called
entre
to
l'offre
try
et la demande
to make
d'électricité.
up for the
Voilà.
balance
Donc,
between the supply and the
effectivement,
demand.
je pense que on peut aller vers un mix plus
Therefore, I could say
renouvelable.
that yes, we could go for
Et,
a more renewable
et en fait, le
mix.
problème de l'intermittence n'est pas. Si on regarde en particulier dans nos pays
If we were to
européens la
keep
complémentarité de
in
l'éolien et
Europe
du solaire,
this
ça
mix
règle une
combination,
grosse partie de
it
l'intermittence.
would
Il
remain
faudra des
a
centrales
great part of that
d'à
mix. We
pointe,
would need to have
mais
more
elles ne fonctionneront pas très
other kind
longtemps
of
dans
plants, which
l'année.
would probably not
Elles fonctionneront
function
à un
for
coût
long
élevé, mais pas très
because
longtemps
they
dans
would be
l'année, ce qui
much
fait que
more costly,
globalement,
but for
on
a
pourra
shorter time
bénéficier
period
d'une
in the
énergie
year.
électrique bon
So we could
marché
combine
et très
cheaper type
décarbonée,
of
dans la mesure où ces
power
centrales fonctionneront quelques centaines d'heures dans
because
l'année,
these other
ces
plants, which are
centrales
more
émettrices de gaz
costly,
à effet de
would
serre, qui pourraient
probably
d'ailleurs
function
être,
only a few
qui
hours in
pourraient
the
utiliser des
year.
combustibles
They might
verts
be using
à
maybe
partir de la
green fuel
transformation par l'électricité, un
by
certain nombre
transformation through
par exemple, de
electricity,
l'hydrogène ou autres,
like hydrogen or other
permettrait
things
d'avoir des combustibles verts de synthèse dans
to
quelques années.
get more green fuel in a few years' time. Okay, thank you for your input. Now I'm going to turn to Frédéric Boyer, the project manager of Covenant of Mayors, talking about the consumers and also the actors of production, as we've been observing for the last 2 years. Okay, my question is as follows. Has the crisis made the capacity of the cities more fragile to invest in this renewable energy? And if so, how much so? What level of financing and etc. Okay, thank you, Amaury. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this discussion. Just to remind all the participants that I work for a European network based on European policies and especially supporting this Covenant of Mayors, which has spread out to the whole world. I've noticed that we do have quite a few participants from the African continent. We have a few initiatives there to support actions of cities in their renewable transition, renewable energy transition. Now, regarding the capacity of cities to invest in the production of renewable energy for the consumers, but also for producers, and this is true in the European context when we have new laws to enable local powers, local governments to support dynamics. You mentioned the difficulty of certain local governments to remanipulate with countries which are very sharp on this topic, like Germany, for example. And as a network, we're trying to also deploy in our own countries, but with the new laws now and the possibility to apply both on production and also on energy-saving policies to favor exchanges between consumer to consumer, citizen to citizen. So these new laws, which are being implemented in the state members, will slowly be used as political opportunities by local governments. Here and there, we started to notice new pilot cases, if you like, which we want to try to implement and use. So the crisis, of course, has had an impact on the local governments to invest. We've seen it on other sectors like mobility, for example, that it has led to some changes in terms of mobility by forcing or by removing the place that cars had in the past to give more room for cycling, for pedestrians. This was fairly easy to implement in order to fight against the pandemic. Now, when we talk about energy production, it's a bit more complicated. We're talking about a lot of investments there that could already be missing beforehand, and the capacity which the local governments had to put on other places in order to manage the health crisis. One thing to recall, however, in the European context, that before the crisis, there was a real willingness from the EU to become the first continent to mitigate the carbon print. With a support, financial support of the EU towards local governments and towards some companies in order to either produce RE energy or also to reduce the demand. There was already a willingness that was there with a financing focus, which I think was increased by the economic recovery. We're talking about 100 billion of euros for local actors who will be in a position to present new projects. Even though the crisis has impacted these capacities, I would say that in the coming months, there will be an opportunity, at least on the European level, for local governments and cities to launch new projects, whether it be from recovery or the buildings or the production of renewable energy. What we need to keep in mind, however, and this was already the case before, was that cities and also the regions were lacking human capacity and know-how for putting together these projects, not so much lacking resources or financial resources, but a lack of capacity to actually come up with some project that can then be financed. So through the Covenant and mayors and the energy cities, we are working on two aspects to make sure that the rules, the laws, etc., should not be too binding and would enable cities to innovate, which would require technical innovation, but a lot of governing as well to implement these projects. We also want to make sure that the money goes to the right place in this recovery plan. We also are discussing about helping other sectors like the aviation, which are not good for the climate, etc., which, we want to make sure this goes to the right place. So we are really facilitating a local and green energy and not the large industrial sectors. The local dimension for us is very important in this recovery plan to help the smaller companies to recover. And therefore, we need to have a support with existing tools at a European level, which would still need continue to develop and increase. And these support tools or technical assistance, if you like, for those of you who may know projects in Europe, like Elena, or a facility for cities that we launched recently to really help local actors to put together some projects that investors might be willing to finance later on. There is a willingness from investors to really support energy transition projects. Thank you, Frédéric. Yes, it's a great challenge in this recovery plan is to not destabilize cities, but to support them. Now we're going to run a second round of questions regarding the actors' strategy. We have Mathieu Ozano. We're talking about the gas and oil use and electricity use cannot necessarily substitute each other. You spoke about the decline of investment, which could create some problems in the safety issues. Now, how do you perceive the first signs of this new orientation of the oil and gas companies towards electricity, which seems to have speeded up in 2020? Have we noticed a diversification, or could we take it further? Can we go further as they are trying to align on the Paris Agreement? I think as of today, if we look at Total, for example, in France, what we have noticed with a diversification of their activities, if you look at the oil production of Total, what Total sells as a raw oil has not been changing. Total remains in the oil sector. Now, the first two questions regarding investment. Now, what we're saying is that if Total manages to maintain its oil production,
même si ça n'a pas une part très importante dans la communication, voire ça a une part nulle, absolument.
even though it might not count for much in the communication of Total today, the oil production has been maintained. The production of Total is actually only just declining, again, which shows the issue of the reproduction. So Total before started communicating on direct energy and so on. For the first part of the years 2010s and following, Total had an incredible turnover because of the cost of oil, which was very expensive back then. So they managed to compensate the decline in other parts of the world, like Gabon, the Northern Sea, areas which are mature now. Therefore, the production of oil of Total is maintained. But on the other hand, they have been buying assets and developing other activities of energy at large. For the moment, this is only a small part of their income or total revenues. Now, as for supplying electricity as broker, in what they really supply in terms of energy is a little bit of a secret that everyone knows about. They buy a lot of nuclear energy. There is, on the one hand, a willingness, and we've seen that with other large companies, Western, historical, or European companies, oil companies like BP or Shell or Total, to move on, but to say that they're really committed to a low carbon activities is another story. I think Alain Mestre has joined us now, so I'm going to ask him a few questions now. Talking about the COVID-19 impact first in many European territories. Has the 2020 crisis had any impact on this transition? And then I will ask you to react to what Mathieu has just said. So first of all, Alain Mestre, who is an economic analyst. Sorry, I had some connection issues. I could not follow. In 2020, of course, things accelerated. Now, regarding Europe, and I think you have shown this clearly in your documentation, in 2019 already, we saw an evolution, especially in Europe, but also in America. In America, despite the federal policy of Mr. Trump, in America, as in Europe, there was a decline, a fairly high decline, even in America, a decline of quite a few coal plants for regulation purposes, because each state, as you know, is autonomous in America when it comes to the energy policy. And in Europe, however, even in 2019, for the first time for several years, there was a downgrading and closing down of coal plants in countries like Germany, Spain. Another country which often we forget about, which was which was a large majority, was Denmark in favor of mix. Denmark went from 60% of mixed coal to about 22% today. In favor of investment in renewable energy. So in 2019 already, and these are the figures from the AIE, there was 19% of a decline of coal energy production already in 2019, and even more so in 2020. Even in Poland, if you look at Poland, a country by far that is using the most coal, they went from 2 to 12% of renewable energy. So even a country like Poland, with the support of the European funds.
Je pense que nous avons perdu Monsieur Mestre, du coup.
I think we have lost a connection.
Oui.
Bon, ben,
Et
je vais passer.
nous, on vous entend bien, hein, là, il n'y a pas de problème.
D'accord,
mais
super.
effectivement, on a
Bah, écoutez,
pas
je vais passer, alors je vais rebondir sur les propos.
I'm gonna bounce back on what Mathieu was saying earlier on. We talked about the oil and gas companies, and I just wanted to address another topic with Frédéric and Jean-Yves. Decarbonation is one thing, and as Jean-Yves was saying, we question that. And this morning, the AIA has been saying that the energy consumption had been at the lowest. So I would like to talk about the control of energy and energy production. Now, how can local governments, or how can we make sure that these local governments, how can we support them in the transition to renewable energy? Okay, a mayor or local representative authority needs to meet the citizens or the population's expectations. There are some obvious things of a need for mobility and answering the need for energy. And of course, this crisis has highlighted these difficulties. Therefore, local authorities need to develop policies toward the transition, energy transition. And this is a systemic approach for the environmental, climate and energy transition. Other elements are to be taken into account on, for example, air quality, mobility, etc. Now, what we have seen as the Covenant of Mayors in Europe, especially, what we have noticed is that the priority is towards a reduction of the demand for energy, especially in the building sector, before tackling the issue of energy production, which is much more complex, especially in an urban context, with other strategies like urban and rural, like Paris is doing, and other areas to go and find renewable energy production sources. Now, in the urban context, other than producing a little bit of electricity on roofs, for example, there's not much that we can do. You mentioned a few examples. There are different approaches to try to settle new infrastructures. But at least at a European level, reducing the demand by the renewal of the building sector is very important. This is why we have launched a large initiative for the refitting of the building sector, because most of the actors, whether private or public, is very much behind. We are struggling to reach our goals, which we had set a while ago, when actually these policies are fairly obvious to certain degrees. Now we can have the same objective regarding indirect emissions. which is much more complex and is not the purpose of our debate today. But when it comes to local governments, we've seen a focus on the need to control the demand, and then the issue of energy production for renewable energy production. It is good to remember that heating of buildings is a very high level of energy consumption, especially in our countries. It's actually a lot more important than the demand for electricity, which is why it would justify this investment in the renewing of the building sector. Now, at a local level, we aim at developing local systems for producing energy or renovating these systems if they're already existing. Especially, this is the case especially in Eastern countries, Eastern Europe countries. There is a desire to invest in renovation, whether it be biomass or develop new systems in the existing systems to take care of the climate change issue and also provide for the comfort of their populations. Yes, I think the issue of heating is important. I don't know if Jean-Yves could speak about this and explain how a producer of renewable energy.
Oui, alors effectivement, en prolongement de ce que dit M. Boyer, là, effectivement, il y a besoin de faire des actions d'économie d'énergie et en particulier d'isolation des logements, de réduire nos consommations énergétiques, en particulier pour ce qui concerne le secteur électrique. Il faut savoir que la France est quand même un pays qui est extrêmement électrosensible, hein, et donc on a plutôt thermosensible, c'est-à-dire qu'on a une augmentation de l'appel de puissance sur le réseau d'électricité en dessous de zéro qui est beaucoup plus importante qu'ailleurs en Europe, puisque avec 17% des habitants européens, on représente la moitié de la thermosensibilité européenne. Donc là, il y a effectivement il y a besoin d'isoler les logements et à commencer par les logements pour réduire cette thermosensibilité, mais aussi les logements qui sont de manière plus générale. Et ce qu'il faut voir au-delà de ça, c'est qu'il va falloir aussi préparer nos concitoyens dans les actions de rénovation à pouvoir leur permettre de consommer l'électricité au moment où elle coûte moins cher. Et de ce point de vue-là, en particulier, ce qu'il faut constater, c'est que deux choses. D'une part, dans un mix électrique qui va être très largement renouvelable dans le futur, il sera composé principalement d'éoliennes solaires, au moins en Europe. Et donc, c'est ce que disent aussi les études allemandes vers deux.
But what has been revealed by the various surveys, there will be a majority of these two kinds of energy because they show the greatest potential and they produce the cheapest kind of electricity.
Comme elles ont des facteurs, ce qu'on appelle des facteurs de Sharp, qui sont plus faibles que les énergies pilotables aujourd'hui, hein, ça veut dire qu'il va falloir des capacités installées 3 fois plus importantes pour arriver à ce qu'elles passent à peu près 70 ou 80% du mix.
In order to cover 80 or 90% of the electricity demand.
Beaucoup de moments dans l'année où
Therefore, there will be many moments in the year when there will be an overproduction of electricity and other times when we will need to make up for that.
C'est this overproduction. Comme elles ont un coût marginal, on n'aura pas besoin d'autres énergies, et comme leur coût marginal est faible, on aura des prix électriques qui seront très faibles à ces moments-là.
Another type of energy, and the prices will be very low during that time period of overproduction. So 70% of energy consumption can either be
il va falloir qu'à côté des isolations qu'on va faire dans nos logements, on équipe de moyens de consommer et en particulier de moyens de chauffage de l'habitat et de l'eau de moyens qui permettent de stocker dans les usages. Le
chauffe-eau d'eau, like the water heat boiler, for example,
étant un très bon usage et va permettre effectivement et permettra à nos concitoyens de pouvoir s'approvisionner et arriver à régler une grosse partie de leurs besoins en électricité à des moments où l'électricité sera très peu chère et donc finalement de les rendre plus résilients par rapport effectivement à ces consommations et donc peut-être aussi de sortir ces personnes-là de la précarité. Et là, je voulais rebondir par rapport à ce que disait Frédéric Boyer et d'Énergie City. Il va falloir en particulier que dans tout ce qui est réseau de chaleur, eh bien, on a plutôt faire des réseaux de chaleur qui vont fonctionner avec des systèmes thermodynamiques alimentés, donc la pompe à chaleur étant alimentée par l'électricité et la source froide dont on va pomper les calories, ben ça va pouvoir être par exemple de l'eau, hein,
So we could be using, for
soit
example,
de
water
mer,
as a
soit
source of
de grands
energy.
fleuves. Voilà, nous on est en Finlande.
We are in
Bon,
Finland,
vous avez
for example. You have
une ville comme Helsinki qui est
a city
dans
like
votre réseau.
Helsinki.
Eh bien, effectivement, ils veulent se débarrasser de leur centrale au charbon qui
They want to get rid of their coal
faisait de la
plants.
production d'électricité et en même temps qui alimentait le réseau de chaleur local hein, pour les 800 000 habitants d'Helsinki, ou pas loin. Eh bien, effectivement, une très bonne solution, ce serait
one good solution for them over there, for example, would be
ces besoins de chaleur par des systèmes thermodynamiques qui iraient chercher la chaleur de la source froide dans l'eau à 6 degrés ou 7 degrés en hiver qui peuvent puiser dans la Baltique qui est juste à côté d'Helsinki. Et ça pourrait être alimenté principalement par des éoliennes, sachant que ce pays est extrêmement bien pourvu en énergie éolienne. Voilà donc, et là, et puis quand il y a un peu moins de vent, eh bien, on stocke dans les usages et peut-être avec des systèmes, des liquides qu'on appelle eutectiques ou à changement de phase, on stocke à 60
there are ways to store the energy
les besoins pour pouvoir
and keep it for times when the needs are
effectivement,
higher.
quand il y a un peu moins de ressources
when the
renouvelables,
sources or resources are not as renewable, to be able to dig into that store of energy. This is something that we can do in the rehabilitation or renovation plans. We need to look at investments which will profit from the low prices of energy and spread it out through the year so that the heating consumption could be more evenly spread through some very performing systems, electrical systems, by heating up water or using electricity that will be self-consumed from PV systems, PV panels.
Peut-être un petit peu plus loin. Ce qui évitera d'ailleurs aussi des développements importants des réseaux électriques pour transporter ces surplus de production solaire qu'on aura dans quelques années. Et le problème, ça va être que ce sera les heures de nuit.
So, for example, the night hours would become the midday hours,
le coût de l'électricité, le prix de l'électricité sur le marché sera très faible, ce sera à midi demain.
Spread out more evenly the cost of the electricity.
On va inciter les gens à consommer de l'électricité pour recharger leur ballon. Et ça tombe bien, c'est le moment où il fait le plus chaud, donc quand ce sera système thermodynamique aéro, on aura des COP qui seront à ce moment-là bien meilleurs. Voilà.
Therefore, the results will be a lot better for all of us. Yes, we also talk about a change of behaviors and a change of use. Yes, a change of paradigm. Thank you very much. I think Alain Mestre is back with us again, and we will let him conclude on his field of expertise, and we will ask him the second question regarding the reorientation that we have mentioned regarding the oil and gas companies and the closing down of coal plants. This is already the case in some countries of Europe, like Germany. Now, my question is, how are these companies, or how can they manage this transition in terms of employment? Sorry for this connection problem. Okay, what I was saying is 28% of gas emission is due to coal in Europe, even though it has dropped by 10 points in the last 10 years. Now, regarding the economic and social plan.
Oui, donc il faut pas se leurrer, hein, ça peut provoquer des graves conflits sociaux, des déstabilisations.
This could lead, of course, to social conflicts and to social unsettlement. We've seen this in Romania and mainly, and also in Poland, but also in France, even though coal, we only have 4 plants, see how many problems this is raising in France whenever we want to close a coal plant.
Et donc la question, c'est,
therefore, the issue here is that we need to, we went from 43 to 40% at a world scale. There is a decline, a strong decline, minus 90% in the EU. But let's take a look at the consequences that this would have on the territories. Just to give you 2 examples, we have worked at a European level with the European Union Federation. The new thing that has happened is that 3 years ago, there was a new platform, a European platform for the transition, and we hope that this platform, with the Green Deal and the energy transition, we help to be able to facilitate all these transition projects in Europe, where we're talking about 200,000 employees who need to change or transition to new employment. How do you change these regions that have lived on coal for decades? This is the only energy sector where employees with difficult working conditions, still they have the higher incomes, they have the higher status and all advantages, social protection, etc., etc. So these employees, of course, are resisting when they are told that they need to change jobs and that their coal-fired plants are going to be closed down. In some regions, for the last decade, in one particular region, this is going pretty well because there is a lot of European funds to help to the transition, the Social European Fund, the European Investment Bank, etc. In a region like the Silesia, has been financing the transition to renewable energy, even in a country like Poland. However, it raises other issues. Okay, it's one thing to say you're going to go on pre-retirement, we're going to support you for leaving the coal industry. But another challenge is to get these people into new job, new businesses, especially when they are still young. To try to help people, to redirect people to new business deployment. Therefore, the challenge is to move people from the coal sector to other energy sectors. It requires a lot of training, it requires a lot of pedagogy to help people deploy to new areas of employment, especially in territories that have lived in the coal sectors for decades. We do have successful stories. The one in Europe that is the most successful is the Ruhr region. Since the 80s, 90s, this region has benefited from the European funds. And Germany, as part of the Green Deal, will also continue to benefit from the Transition European Fund to facilitate the deployment of these employees. This is a very sensitive topic. There are still many workers are still working in this coal sector. The target is 2038, but this country probably has been the further in this redeployment of these coal miners. This industry, coal industry, was a source of living for hundreds of thousands of families. So, but they have been really very far in terms of the redeployment strategy to help these workers move towards other businesses, either in the renewable energy sector or in Germany. For example, they have also redeployed these workers in other areas of activities without them losing anything in terms of compensation, in terms of salaries, and all the advantages that they had before, and help them start work in the new sectors of renewable energies and others, or the hydrogen sector, etc. That's a real challenge for a country, especially for regions with high employment due to the coal industry. The whole challenge is to find the right tools. Once you have the financing, you need to find the right tool for making the transition. For example, France has benefited from a 4 billion budget. So this would be a real laboratory for France. How do you redeploy these employment hubs when you're going to close down the 4 coal plants? And our French president has committed by the end of 2020 to close down all the coal plants. That's a real laboratory, but it needs to be made successfully. Yet it's a real challenge if we look at the social conflict that it has arose. Now, when it comes to this employment hub, the challenge is huge. If you speak with the mayor, local mayor of that region, they will explain to you that if the coal plant closes, not only it will lead to high unemployment rate, but all the other consequences for the shopkeepers and all the population. The challenge and this, what is at stake, is huge. So what kind of support device can we provide for it? It's very difficult. I'm not even talking about Cordemais, the other plant in the Loire Valley. Around this area, there is nothing else. Only the coal plant is a source of living for the population. So when they are talking about converting to biomass to prevent the closing down of the plant, this is still in negotiation. Of course, we can discuss this, whether or not we should convert a coal plant into a biomass plant in terms of gas emission. Is this a good thing or not? In France, we're only talking about 4 areas, 4 cities, but if you look at other European countries with whole regions being impacted by this transition, yes, the challenge is huge. Just to close on this, we have to innovate on the various tools and devices for provisional management of skill development.
Et notamment que les 15 milliards du programme d'investissement de compétences, 1 milliard d'euros, aillent au moins de moitié vers des métiers verts et verdissants. Bon, actuellement, on en est donc, et ça veut dire 100 000 travailleurs en reconversion par an. On en est péniblement à 8 000. Hein. sur le programme d'investissement des compétences dédié.
C'est un indicateur à suivre.
Donc, on en est loin de l'objectif que s'est défini la Convention citoyenne climat, parce que déjà sur les aspects reconversion et de gestion prévisionnelle des emplois des compétences, qu'on aille vers des métiers verts et verdissants en matière de reconversion. Ça, c'est un défi considérable, parce que là, on ne peut pas dire, voilà, on a un budget qui est alloué, qui est le PIC, le programme d'investissement des compétences. Alors après, par exemple, dans le cadre du décret programme PPE, le programmation pluriannuelle de l'énergie, il est prévu effectivement qu'il y ait des dispositifs type CVTSIT. Nous, on avait mis en place un dispositif dans l'Île-de-France qui s'appelle ESSECLI, qui est en gros un outil de GPEC dédié secteur et territoire pour effectivement construire des outils passerelles entre les secteurs déclinants et les secteurs et donc les collectivités qui vont bénéficier du développement de ces activités émergentes. Mais ce n'est pas le tout. C'est comment on construit des outils passerelles pour que des travailleurs qui sont dans des activités dites déclinantes ou perdantes puissent bénéficier donc de ces outils passerelles pour être reconvertis dans les secteurs et les territoires qui sont dits gagnants à moyen et long terme. Et donc, voilà, donc pour finir, la proposition qu'a faite la Convention citoyenne climat s'est appuyée, y compris sur des rapports type le rapport Parizeau, qui était le volet, en gros, emploi-compétences du décret PPE, pour assurer toute cette transition dite juste. La transition juste, il faut le rappeler, ce n'est pas simplement un concept, c'est aussi une véritable stratégie qui est intégrée dans l'accord de Paris. Il faut le rappeler, dans l'accord de Paris, il y a la transition juste. Et au niveau européen, il y a, dans le cadre du plan de relance et du pacte vert européen, il y a les mécanismes dits de transition juste. Et donc, ce n'est pas seulement derrière des financements à mettre en place, c'est aussi d'inventer et de mettre en œuvre ces nouveaux dispositifs et outils innovants. Il faudra qu'ils soient innovants, à la fois sur le plan pédagogique, éducation, formation, mais aussi sur le plan purement d'innovation sociale. Et ça, c'est un tas de défis. Sinon, vous aurez des résistances fortes pour assurer ces transitions énergétiques bas carbone.
C'est en tout cas, l'enseignement qu'on retiendra de votre intervention. Voilà, c'est un fort accompagnement financier, mais également en termes de dispositifs, vous en avez exposé pas mal. Je pense que là, vous avez vraiment fait le tour de la question sur les enjeux socio-économiques de la réinsertion des employés. Je vois qu'il y a aussi quelques questions sur l'accès à l'électricité. Donc là, c'est vrai qu'on a parlé beaucoup des défis européens, même en termes de processus de marché, de reconversion des entreprises, ou voilà, tous les enjeux liés à la transition juste dans les pays européens. Effectivement, la question de l'accès à l'électricité dans les pays en développement est une question qui mériterait un second atelier, et sur aussi comment l'Union européenne, dans ses politiques internationales, pourrait aussi favoriser cet accès, orientation des investissements privés et l'aide au développement. Je réponds aussi ainsi directement à la question de Marie-Noëlle Reboulet. Mais je vais devoir conclure la session. Je vous remercie tous. Je vous remercie les intervenants pour vos contributions et puis pour vos interventions et vos réponses aux questions. J'aimerais remercier très brièvement nos partenaires qui nous soutiennent dans notre travail. Voilà, donc public comme privé. Et si vous avez des questions précises, n'hésitez pas à nous recontacter directement par mail, et on pourra vous mettre en contact avec l'un des 4 intervenants aujourd'hui. Je vous remercie. Je m'excuse pour les petits soucis de connexion qu'ont pu avoir les uns et les autres. Et je vous souhaite une très bonne journée. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, au revoir.
Au revoir.
Merci, au revoir.
Et...